Unlike the movie world, where a second film usually fails to recapture the magic of a much-loved first, sequels in gaming are often better than their initial outing. They take the parts fans loved the most, tinker and refine them, chuck out what didn't work, and try something new. Characters are given more personality and backstory, stories evolve, and worlds are fleshed out. Of course, this magic can't continue forever, especially if the series is particularly long-running, but in those cases, they either bow out gracefully or completely reinvent themselves. Then there are the games that, for one reason or another, failed to stick the landing so spectacularly that not only did they sink as an individual title, they sunk their entire franchise in the process. Games that shook up the formula in the wrong way, failed to evolve with the times, or were just plain rubbish. We've looked at a few already, but unfortunately there are plenty more. The following titles didn't just let themselves down, they let their whole series down. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are 10 more games that killed their franchise. Number 10. Killzone Shadowfall. Once a flagship franchise for PlayStation, the Killzone series put players into the hard-as-nails combat boots of ISA veterans Captain Jan Templar and Sergeant Tomas Sevchenko as they fought off the invading gas mask-wearing space Nazis known as Helghast, and later took the fight to their home planet of Helgen. These games focused almost entirely on one thing: war. The blood-soaked front lines, the large-scale skirmishes, the D-Day-esque dropship landings, they had an aesthetic and they stuck with it. But come the end of the third game, the Helghast were all but wiped out and the trilogy wrapped up. Where was the series to go next? Enter Killzone Shadowfall and its admittedly clever idea of sticking both the ISA and surviving Helghast on the same planet and allowing trouble to slowly brew. Now, Shadowfall wasn't a bad game by any account. It had a serviceable, if short, single-player campaign and a hectic multiplayer. It just wasn't what fans wanted. They wanted more high stakes, high adrenaline action, more over-the-top cartoonishly evil villains to hate, and more war. Compared to the others, Shadowfall's campaign was too sluggish and, dare we say it, boring, and it killed the franchise dead. With Guerrilla's Horizon series doing so well, it seems Killzone has been left in the dust with Helgen. Number 9. Crackdown 3. Isn't it a shame when you wait 10 years for a sequel, all the while expecting to get a game that has evolved with the times and taken advantage of every new idea and technological upgrade in that time, only to receive something so horribly stuck in the past, it's embarrassing. The original Crackdown was praised upon its release in 2007 for its, for the time, incredibly detailed open-world city, stylish cel-shaded graphics, and above all, its wonderfully over-the-top gameplay. Hopping around rooftops and blasting away bad guys like a super soldier superhero was peak gaming and a blast to just lose yourself in. The second, released a few years later, and, well, it was more of the same, but for gamers in 2010, that was A-OK. Then the third game arrived almost a decade later, and it still hadn't changed a thing. What was impressive in the early 2000s had been outdone 100-fold by games since, but for all its superhero speed, Crackdown 3 simply hadn't been able to keep up. Gameplay was bland and repetitive, the story was dull, and to top it all off, the promised cloud computing-powered destruction was scaled down significantly. You know it's bad when not even Terry Crews can save your game. Number 8. Command & Conquer 4 Tiberium Twilight. While the Command & Conquer brand name isn't exactly dead, the fact that nothing has come out in the last decade but mobile titles and a remastered collection of the first 2 games tells us it probably should be. Do note that said remastered collection only includes the first 2 titles. Command & Conquer's tragic fall from grace may have started with the third game, but it was the fourth that hammered in the final nail. Set on a near-future version of Earth in which heavily armed and wonderfully camped factions fight over a precious resource known as Tiberium, the Command & Conquer series quickly made a name for itself as one of the greatest real-time strategy games ever. However, in EA's infinite wisdom, everything that made these games so beloved by the fanbase, the in-depth strategy, the base building, the outrageously overacted story, was either hastily slapped together or removed entirely when it came to Tiberium Twilight. And if that wasn't enough to put long-time players off, the needlessly aggressive DRM software and necessity to constantly be connected to the internet certainly was. Even worse, connectivity issues meant players couldn't even access the multiplayer for a long time after launch. Terry Crews couldn't save Crackdown, but maybe more Tim Curry could have saved Command & Conquer. Space! Something to think about. Number 7. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Sometimes a change in direction is exactly what a game needs to rejuvenate the fan base. It worked for Resident Evil when it reimagined the series into a slower-paced first-person title. It worked for God of War when it transformed itself into a critically acclaimed character-focused affair. It did not work, however, for Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Quite why the sequel to two of the most beloved, highly acclaimed, practically perfect platformers of all time needed to shake things up quite so much is beyond me, but here we are. Nuts and Bolts retains much of the series' humour and style, and as such was viewed fairly favourably by many critics, but it also introduced the vehicle construction mechanic, which was much more divisive. Some loved the change, saying it brought Banjo-Kazooie into gaming modernity. Others hated it, saying it made the game entirely unrecognisable. Despite the controversy, the disappointing sales figures spoke for themselves. Overall, fans and even many of the developers themselves were unhappy with Banjo-Kazooie's new direction, and as a result, the dream was over. Perhaps the pair could still go back to their platforming roots, but considering spiritual successor Yooka-Laylee's equally dismal sales, maybe it's best they stay in retirement. Number 6. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. The Marvel vs. Capcom series was like a 10-year-old's cheese-induced fever dream come true. What if Wolverine and Hulk fought Ryu and Dante on the roof of the Daily Bugle? It sounded too crazy to work, but work it did, and fans couldn't get enough superhero versus Street Fighter suplexing action. The concept was so popular, in fact, that it spawned 8 games, each scoring favourably among critics and performing well commercially. Each, that is, until Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. After so many standout games, fans expected a certain level of quality and quantity from Capcom. Infinite fell flat on both accounts. Gone were long-standing staples such as 3-on-3 battles and character assist moves, leading to a feeling of Capcom dumbing things down. The art style and animation had taken a notable step back too, feeling stiff and lazy. The story mode was uninspired, and despite having plenty of characters to pick from, there were notably fewer than in previous entries. The worst offender on that count was that the X-Men, who had been in every previous game, were conspicuously absent, likely due to a legal dispute between Disney and Fox. Overall, fans were disappointed, and the series was, like a certain super soldier, put on ice indefinitely. I suppose you could say this game was infinitely boring. Got 'em. Number 5. Thief 2014. Attempting to reimagine the series that helped kick off both the stealth genre and immersive sims for more modern audiences was always going to be a tall task, one that required ample care and attention to pull off. Unfortunately, Eidos Montreal just weren't up to it, and like a bumbling burglar blundering in the night, failed to capture the magic that made the original series so treasured. The original Thief came out in 1998 and essentially created the template for all things sneaky and stealthy, with its influence being felt in games like Dishonored and Hitman. Its 2 sequels further refined its light and shadow-based gameplay, giving players almost complete control over how they completed heists. Being so innovative and experimental for its time, fans looked back on the series fondly and wanted nothing less than perfection from the 2014 reboot. Unfortunately, they were severely disappointed. Thief 2014 wasn't terrible, it was just terribly underwhelming. With dull writing that somehow made a master thief the most boring man on the planet, inconsistent AI and poor level design that players could easily exploit to rob themselves of any challenge, and copious bugs, it wasn't a patch on the games that came before. It bungled the job so badly, in fact, it killed the franchise before it had a chance to re-emerge. Number 4. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. You'd think a series as long-running and beloved as Castlevania would, much like its main antagonist, never die, but here we are. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 came out in 2010, and there hasn't been a new entry in the series since. Much of the blame could certainly be placed on Konami and their bizarre attitude towards their once-beloved IPs, but a good portion should also be levelled at Lords of Shadow 2. The first Lords of Shadow reimagined Castlevania as a 3D hack and slasher akin to God of War or Devil May Cry, with protagonist Gabriel Belmont racking up combos and whipping werewolves into the next life with balletic ease. It was a change that worked, garnering praise and high sales. It also ended on one heck of a cliffhanger, with protagonist Gabriel Belmont becoming the vampire Lord Dracula. Surely a sequel building on that setup would be a surefire success, right? Well, no. Lords of Shadow 2 was somehow a huge step down. The combat was just as fun and engaging, but everything else, from the iffy graphics and the woefully inept stealth sections to the convoluted and confusing story, were just terrible. Worst of all were the modern-day Dracula sections. Playing as the Lord of Darkness himself would have been an unholy power fantasy, but, well, it lacked bite. Number 3. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Set in a transhumanist future where augmentations have become the norm, the Deus Ex games allowed players to live out their best Blade Runner fantasies and give them the tools necessary to complete missions in any way they pleased. The series went on hiatus after Invisible War, only to come roaring back with Human Revolution. Once again, Eidos Montreal held the reins, but this time they hit the ground running with a polished new take on the series. This game starred Adam Jensen, a security officer turned augmented killing machine, as he he unraveled conspiracies in a world on the edge of technological revolution set before the original games. It was a great starting block. Adam was an interesting and likable character, the world was wonderfully detailed and realized, and the plot, while a little silly, was gripping. Its sequels should have been golden. However, a long production time saw publisher Square Enix push Mankind Divided out the door before it was ready. This resulted in a story that felt both rushed and truncated, with a narrative that abruptly ended the moment things were starting to get interesting. And that's not even mentioning the weird 5-tier pre-order campaign. With low sales, the series was put on hold, meaning Adam's story will likely never be resolved. We didn't ask for this, and Adam didn't either. Number 2. Dino Crisis 3. More than just Resident Evil with dinosaurs, the Dino Crisis series was its own special take on the survival horror formula and made such an impact that it still has a veritable army of fans clamoring for a sequel, a reboot, anything. Really, more than 2 decades after the last game released. It's surprising then that there were only 2 good games in the series, the first and the second, through which all that goodwill was created. With dinosaur islands, time gates, shady scientists, and spandex-wearing super soldiers, the games were certainly out there, but they knew what they wanted to be and told a cohesive, if convoluted, story. Then Dino Crisis 3 came along and threw all that out the window. Or, more accurately, out the airlock. Yes, Dino Crisis 3 was set in space. The last choice locale when writers completely run out of ideas. Tune in tomorrow for our new space-themed revamp. Gone were the characters fans had grown to love, and gone were the series' survival horror roots. Enemy design was sorely lacking when compared to the previous games, the space station design was too samey and linear, and the camera was absolutely abysmal, failing to keep up with players' faster movements. All of this added up to a recipe for extinction for the series. Number 1. Dead Space 3. Oh, EA, why? Just why? You took an incredibly successful survival horror game and tried to widen its appeal and rake in more money by removing literally everything that made it work, everything that fans love. And how did that work out for you? Oh, the game bombed, and blaming the developers, you had Visceral Games shut down. Great. The original Dead Space is a masterclass in survival horror. From the atmospheric and claustrophobic corridors of the USG Ishimura to the horrendous sound design to the skin-crawlingly grotesque monster design, it has it all. Coupled with a killer story and gruesomely Moorish gameplay, EA found themselves with a surprise hit on their hands, and a sequel was quickly greenlit. Dead Space 2 took the horror to the next level but also dialed up the action. It was still heart-pounding, but in more ways than one. It sold phenomenally, and so a threequel was quickly put into production. Unfortunately, this is where corporate greed took over. Instead of doubling down on the game's strengths, EA muscled in a tacked-on co-op experience, diluted the horror and amped up the action, and threw in so many god-awful microtransactions it was almost funny. Why waste time cutting the limbs off a necromorph yourself when you can just have EA butcher it for you? Genius.